Hello and welcome to TechBBQ. I'm Amy, editor of Sifted, and the last time I was at TechBBQ I had to take a COVID test when I arrived at the airport, so the mood I would say is a lot more optimistic today, and that is what we're going to be speaking about on the panel, a kind of sense check of how Europe's doing, what the reasons to be optimistic are, and what maybe some of the challenges ahead still are. And joining me, let me do this in order, I have Kitty Mayo, who's the CEO of Project Europe. I have Iwona Biernat, who's the legal strategy lead at the EU Inc., which we'll talk about later what exactly that is. I have Victor Riparbelli, who's the CEO and co-founder of Synthesia, and I have Johan Brenner, who's a general partner at Creandum. So I feel like the energy this year in Europe feels kind of different. It feels more optimistic, and I'd say there's a kind of bullishness around European founders that in the 8 years I've been at Sifted, I don't think we've had before. Kitty, would you agree? Why do you think that is?
I definitely agree. And I mean, there are many different reasons. I think, obviously, geopolitical. There's been a far more of a onus on Europe to stand on its own. There's been such an emphasis on sovereignty and our ability to produce our own great founders, fund them, and have those companies operating in Europe. But also, I think there's definitely been a real shift with the ascending generation, whereby they've had access to essentially the global resource of opinion and education. And so a 25-year-old now has grown up being able to watch. I mean, it usually starts with the social network, but then access US media, they've had access to founders, etc., who are doing these things from a very early stage, and so it's far more programmed into this ascending generation that they can actually go out and do huge things from the outset, and it's beginning to compete with the European traditional institutional mindset of get a banking job, etc., etc., etc. And so, yeah, it feels very real to me. That is the world I operate in, though. So, I guess.
Victor, you must. I mean, you're in the network of the kind of young, successful founders, and I imagine you therefore meet loads of the even younger or newer companies as well. Why do you think it is? What's pulling people into running startups in Europe, perhaps even more so than we've seen recently at the moment?
I think there's a bunch of different things. I think one thing is that in general, the tech world has become much more global over the last 5 or 10 years, right? In other words, it feels less important where you build. It's much more. When I started my company in 2017, it was much harder to build from Europe. I think that gap has definitely lessened, even though it definitely still exists. And then I also feel like there's some new energy in Europe. I think the Western world is in somewhat of a crisis mode, I would argue, and especially in Europe, where I think we've lost belief in anything but climate change and maybe wokeness to some extent. And so I think there's a counter movement now of people who want to build, who want to change, and put Europe back on the map. I think there's lots of good things happening. And I think we're starting to see momentum. We're starting to see European companies actually leading on the world stage, which is somewhat new. If you look at a lot of the big successes from the last 10 years, a lot of them are kind of local players, right? Or regional players that are winning by copying an American model. And I think it's really awesome that we're starting to see, companies that are actually leading on the global stage. There's still lots of issues, I think, both structural but also cultural. I think everything is downstream from the cultural thing of we don't celebrate ambition and drive and competition the same way they do in the US, but I do feel it's changing. I do think there's it's almost kind of like the new counterculture. It's actually being very pro-growth, wanting us to succeed, wanting us to win. And I think that's a movement that's definitely growing. And I mean, we're seeing that in Project Europe, right, with all the amazing young talent that we're getting in who wants to win and want to put Europe on the map. And I think just having institutions like that where people can gather and meet other like-minded folks is just incredibly important.
Do you think, and Johan, are you seeing it have an impact when it comes to the quality of companies as well? Because I would totally agree. There's it's almost like all the founders got together and are from now on, we're going to be really optimistic about Europe, and we're all going to post loads on LinkedIn about how great Europe is. But does it actually translate? Johan, do you feel like companies are better to?
I mean, if you take a step back, our ecosystem is 30 years old. And in the US it's 60 years old, and so our trajectory, we are rapidly catching up. And why is that? Well, because we have role models up there like Spotify, Klarna, and others, Synthesia, building global companies, and those role models are so abundant than we had 10 years ago. And then I think the access to capital is not a constraint anymore. So like 20 years ago, we didn't have a venture capital ecosystem in Europe, or ecosystem for that matter. But nowadays, I mean, 30% of the seed funding goes into European companies, and that's accelerating with AI, et cetera, and all the startups that's happening. So I'm very bullish on Europe. Still, we have some things to work on and fundamentally catch up. But I think AI boom has really accelerated that opportunity.
Yeah, and I guess the AI boom may be one particular interesting example is Stockholm, right? Like you live in Stockholm, and we've got this real like hub of AI companies that all sort of seem to be organizing events with one another and supporting one another and sort of building up.
Yeah, but I think it's happening in every single city. I mean, what's interesting, if you look at the stats, we have like 200 to 300 unicorns in Europe, and they come from 65 cities, not one city or not two. So Europe is truly flat. So I think the opportunity is and Stockholm, of course, but London is, of course, and France and Paris, and you have all these hubs that are producing their own AI superstars. So I think it's not only Stockholm, but we're proud of what's happening in Stockholm right now, of course, but it's not only in Stockholm.
Yeah. And Iwona, this is, I guess, the perfect moment, talking of Europe being flat, of some of the challenges we have. Do you want to explain a little bit about what EU Inc. is and the kind of, I guess, one of the big challenges as you see it in Europe that it's trying to counter?
Yes, of course. So EUing is a grassroots movement by pretty much the whole of the European ecosystem, calling for an EU-level digital first, a single optional entity for Europe, so that you can scale across all of Europe. You can raise capital from anywhere across cross-border Europe, foreign capital, and it's meant to simplify how you set up company. Because we have been in this era of like Europe being stuck in negativity cycle, and loads of founders were very frustrated with setting up a company. It takes weeks. For example, in Germany, it can take even like up to a month because you have to go to a notary, and all of these frustrations with like how quickly you can raise money in the US versus in Europe have turned into this huge petition of 16,000 who have essentially global tech leaders who've signed a petition that resonated so much with the whole of the ecosystem, because there are so many structural issues still at the moment in Europe if you want to scale a company. Like, it's so much easier to go to the US instead of staying in Europe. But those frustrations, we're now seeing founders to actually be like, we want to mobilize and we want to action, we want to bring an action, we want change, and we need to do this ourselves. Like we can't just let the policymaker do their own thing. We need to be more engaged, and we're seeing a lot of momentum around that. So EU Inc. at the moment is working with Brussels on what's called 28 regime. That, again, as I said, will be a pan-European entity for Europe. It's actually happening. We're not calling for it anymore. It's work in progress. We have weekly meetings with Brussels. So we're making sure that the ambition stays, that there is one single standard for Europe, as opposed to having to navigate 27 different legal systems. So it's a really exciting time for Europe. There's so much energy, so much engagement. I think pretty much everyone here signed the petition. If you haven't, you still can. And I invite everyone to join our campaign next month. Yeah.
I think it's a real good starting point, what you're doing. I mean, there are a lot of things we want to change, but I mean, getting one regulation and one company to start from, which is homogeneous across Europe, sounds simple, but it's difficult, but it's one thing that we push through. And then you can add on other policy changes after that. That's truly needed as well. But I think it's great that you are really spearheading this.
Yeah, I mean, reforms, I would say that in order to make a difference and to build something, you have to take it step by step. You can't fix everything. You have to start somewhere. And I strongly believe, and I think the ecosystem believes, that this is like our first step towards more unified, actual single market and for startups. So it's really exciting.
Victor, as you said, your company, you started in 2017, so you're a bit more later stage now. What would be maybe 2 things you would love to have different in Europe to help your company make life easier for your company right now?
I think EU Inc. is a great start, right? Like operating across all different countries is a headache, both in terms of staffing, in terms of sales, etc. So I think that would just equalize the playing field, right? And it would make the European region a bit closer to North America in terms of like it's kind of like one unified market that's simpler to operate in. I think that's definitely the first one. The second one, I think all the kind of rules and regulations, tax laws around options, for example. We have an office in Denmark. We had 2 people from Slovenia, not even Danish people. They got a bunch of options in Tunisia. They worked with us for 5 years. They wanted to move out the country. And they can't because they have to pay tax on unrealized gains on startup shares, right? And it's a lot of these kind of small paper cuts that just make it really difficult to build global hubs here. Like if an American knows that you get taxed on unrealized gains if you're going to move out the country again, you're basically handcuffed to live in Denmark, right? So there's so many of these things that just does not make any sense. Unrealized gains, I think, in general, is something we really want to like try and get out of, because it just makes structurally so much harder, right? And it doesn't make it very appealing to go to Europe. I think what we do have in Europe is actually a great brand, right? Like a lot of people love Europe as a place to go on vacations, to go on holidays. In London, we found that it's easier to move people from the Bay Area to London than from the Bay Area to New York because the idea of living in London is appealing. I think the idea of living in Denmark is appealing to a lot of people. But if we make it really difficult on the financials and the tax and those kind of things, then unfortunately I think a lot of it stops there, right? So if we did those things and we did a marketing campaign of like how nice it is to live in Europe, free healthcare, free schools, great jobs, great companies. Like there's all those things I think would improve our situation so much.
Just to add on that option, I think as part of the e-wing movement, we've also recommended that ESOP is standardized across Europe so you can tap into talent anywhere. So if you incorporate in Germany, you have your administrative sit in that country, you can actually grant options anywhere in Europe. Taxes stay local, but we are recommending that unrealized gains, like there's no charge at the upfront. We're trying to standardize that so that it's more similar to how it works in the UK or US, and you can tap into talent anywhere. Taxes stay local, but there are some like capital gains tax as opposed to income tax, and also the timing of taxation, which you mentioned, should be on exit, not on the day when you actually receive shares. And I think this would be a huge win for Europe because then you can encourage more talent to join your company, and you don't have to navigate again 27 different legal systems because you have this one standardized entity, one set of documents, not 27 set of documents, because that's another friction for a lot of startups that you have to actually engage lawyers in each country you want to grant shares because it has a different legal system. So hopefully something that will be solved.
We're in a tech war, right? I mean, and how do you win that? Is it by innovation? And how do you innovate as having the best talent? I mean, we're really competing for having the environment where people want to love to live in Europe and work out of Europe. So I mean, I think it's fundamental. So we really need to push that agenda. Make sure that Europe is the best place to innovate from.
And Iwona, how receptive are the various policymakers in either the Commission, in the EU, or in the individual countries, to all of the kind of changes you're proposing? Do they see what Victor says, that like, and what Johan says? We've got all the right ingredients, but there's all these problems we've put in place for ourselves that if we eliminated them, we'd have a much better chance of growth.
Yeah, the way I see it is like we can have all these shiny cars, which are here founders' ideas, but if you don't have the roads, and you have to essentially build highways, otherwise you can't use your car, right? So we've got everything, all the ingredients, and now we need to build those highways. And this is the story we've been telling policymakers. They have been super engaged on this topic with founders. Like I said, we are representing now 16,000 signatories. I don't know how much money that is and how much that translates, but it's like John Collison has signed the petition. We have Matt Clifford, who implemented the AI action plan in the UK. And then we've got like Victor, who signed the petition. And so we're representing that at the European Commission level, and Brussels has opened their doors. Startup associations have worked and lobbied for EU-Inc., which is 28 regime, for 8 years, but we brought that momentum by bringing the whole of the ecosystem to Brussels doors, and they really open to hear what the challenges are, and they really want to solve it. Of course, it will require political buy-in, and also it will require more courage in leadership if we want to really change Europe, and those are the kind of conversation we've been having with policymakers. So yes, I'm seeing a lot more engagement from them to really understand what the root problems and what are the systematic problems. So to be honest with you, when I started working with them, I was under impression they didn't really understand what is going on, like how much we need an infrastructure to build innovation. And finally, I'll just add that last year, Draghi report has brought innovation gap in Europe to the front center of policy making. So there is no better time than now. Also with the economic shifts that have been happening in the world order, there's no better time than now to make that change happen, because there is a lot of resistance around like, oh, it will never happen because of that negativity that we're used to in Europe. But I don't believe that. I think times have changed, so bring it on.
And I feel like we're seeing more and more founders become more and more, I feel like we're seeing more and more founders become more sort of political, maybe it's not political, but being more vocal about policy issues. Why do you think that is? I mean, Victor, you're one of the people who will, sign petitions for things that you believe in. Like, why is that happening, and why is that so important for founders to be, lobbying for things basically these days?
I think there's a lot of frustration, right? Like, I think a lot of founders love Europe. I love Denmark. I love Europe as a region, and I want Europe to succeed, but we're putting so many stupid barriers in front of ourselves to actually make it succeed. And I think now that the vibe has shifted a little bit on the global stage, I think more people feel more comfortable in speaking up, which I think a lot of people, frankly, just didn't like 3 or 4 years ago, because it wasn't really worth the potential backlash that you'd get. But I think there is this like vibe shift, and I think people feel more comfortable. And I also think in general, right, with the tensions with the US, I think most people are now thinking that this is not just like a nice to have. We probably should be, as a region, more independent, have our own big tech companies. And I think those are the kind of things that pushes people to take action, right? And then I think that combined with the fact we now have a bunch of great companies with, I think that have a voice and hopefully can move the needle to some extent, I think is really important. The other thing I would say is, I think just in Europe, I think we have sort of a problem where a lot of the governments here think a lot about like quantity of startups. Like if you look in the Danish ecosystem, right, it's a lot about how can we fund all the unfundable ideas, right? There's a team of like 3 people, they can't raise funding from the private markets. How do we help them so we get more companies? And I don't think that's necessarily like a bad idea, but that should not be the focal point, right? Like great teams can raise money. The VC market is global now. The issue is much more one of quality. We need 1 or 2 or 3 really, really, really big tech companies in Europe. But to do that, we have to look at things like tax, which is very unpopular, right? It's much more popular to, let's give grant to like lots of small companies that wouldn't make it otherwise. And I think that goes back to that like cultural thing we have in Europe, where we love the underdog, but as soon as a company actually starts succeeding, we don't like it, right? They probably screwed someone over to get there, or they're evil, they're, extra, there's whatever, like, we don't like that, and I think that's the big barrier we have to kind of get over. We actually should sit down and listen to not my companies, but bigger companies than us, and figure out what do you need to scale your company 10x in Europe. And a lot of people are not going to like the answers, because it's got to be about like tax, for example. But I think there's now more louder voices, and I also feel like in Brussels there's somewhat of a shift compared to like 5 years ago, where I feel like people were just like not listening at all.
So it's shifting to a bit more of an almost VC mindset of like, there are only going to be so many winners, and like we can't waste our time with the long tail. If we're thinking strategically, like Europe needs a champion in this, a champion in that, a homegrown company that does XYZ strategic sovereign
The power law thing goes for not just for VCs who want to make money, right? It goes for ecosystems as well. And you've seen that in Sweden, right, where they have like a really big company like Spotify, Klarna, these companies. They create lots of wealth for all the employees who go out and start their own funds, become angel investors, they start companies. It starts to become a thing that, actually maybe instead of going to Safeway and consulting or banking, you're going to a startup and you actually can make some money. Like those really, really, really big outsized home runs, they have such huge impact on the ecosystem. we haven't really had that in Denmark, for example, right? And I think that's why the Danish ecosystem is very far behind the Stockholm ecosystem.
Yeah, and Kitty, you're closest, I guess, or you're one of the closest to the kind of super early stage and young talent. What are the reasons people are drawn to entrepreneurship at the moment, and what are maybe some of the things that hold great talent back or make them want to go work for a bigger company or just another company rather than starting their own one?
I think there are various different brands of entrepreneurship, but lots of the founders we're working with are people who set out to do crazy, slightly impossible things from a very young age. There are also lots of other. I'm talking specifically about people who want to build VC-backable businesses, not just entrepreneurs in general. An example is this guy we're working with, Alex, who is this founder from Greece. Grew up in Thessaloniki, which is not necessarily a startup hub. His father did repairs on fishing boats. He wasn't from an ecosystem where he was being given heaps and heaps of resources to build things, but he had access to PCBs pretty early on. He was doing a bit of hardware engineering. And he said to me that he had this moment when he was 13 years old, and it was when GPT-2 came out, and he thought, this is awesome, but I'm going to be too far behind in order to be able to do something that changes the world in this domain. And so he started looking at hardware, and now he is 21 years old, still in Athens, and he's built this crazy humanoid robot with basically no funding, no access to support, etc. No, he doesn't know any other engineers. He's done it totally by himself. And the thing that's motivated him was, I want to do world-changing, awesome stuff. And actually, I'm seeing a lot more founders his age wanting to build in hardware because it feels like a place where they really do have the potential to be at the frontier, the people who change the world, the people who create that 0 to 1 platform shift. And so the majority of the founders I'm working with, that's their core motivation, and they are kids who've grown up with access to all the tools, all the resources that they need to actually build the knowledge to do those things. So that is the main thing, and genuinely, so many of them come back to moments of inspiration when they were 13 or 14 years old, watching The Social Network when they were young, and then realizing that there was an avenue for them to be able to build something that will impact the lives of millions.
Yeah, and sorry, Johan?
Oh.
We've spoken a bit maybe about the kind of tech sovereignty angle. And Europe obviously has, we have some amazing AI companies, there's defense companies, there's good energy companies, but it still feels like on some quite critical areas we don't have a homegrown champion. Johan, where would you say we still really need to invest if we're looking at things from that point of view?
Well, we're very good at building applications on top of the models in Europe, and we have some model companies, Mistral, etc. But most of the capacity is built, and the development there is built in the US. I think there's something that we should think about. Is that something that will hurt us in the end, and do we need to invest more? And I do think we have to invest more in capacity for data centers and compute in Europe. And what can we compete in then? What's fundamental is cheap energy costs. It's the best people, we talked about that. It's chip technology, maybe we have that. It's the algorithms, again, to come back to smart people. But can we compete in these fundamental parts of the ecosystem? Then maybe we can build true competitive edge out of Europe. And one of that is cheap energy, which we don't talk about that much.
Yeah. When we're talking a lot about talent, we're hearing more about these reverse acqui-hires when big tech companies buy a kind of pretty early stage, small, especially seen it in AI company, basically to get hold of the founders who are amazing engineers. Is that, Kitty, would you be upset if that happened to some of the Project Europe companies? Or how do we feel that what position does that put Europe in if we get a lot of big US tech companies swooping in and just absorbing great people?
It's not what Project Europe exists to do, it would be a great indicator that we're picking great founders if we have a few isolated instances of that. But the reason that founders are coming to Project Europe and the reason we're backing them is because they want to set out to build their own enormous things. But yeah, as I said earlier, we are seeing so many amazing applications for people who want to build hard tech hardware. And I think, and then, so at the other end, we're seeing a lot of founders wanting to build, so on the application layer, we're not seeing so many people wanting to build, I guess, like frontier AI, novel models, etc. So, I mean, to answer your question, no, it wouldn't be. I wouldn't be like super upset if some of our companies got acqui-hired, but like long term, if they all get acqui-hired, it'd be an awful outcome. But long term, these founders want to build enormous companies of their own.
Johan, is that something have you seen any reverse acqui-hires happen or be suggested to your portfolio, and how do you kind of feel about that as a phenomenon?
I mean, it happens all the time. So historically, it's happened less, more and more when the lack of talent and hunt for talent is there. And I think in some cases it's companies that haven't really been able to reach escape velocity, and they find another home for the company. But I think also from the buyer side, I think it's being more of an active route to talent than more defensive way before. So I think that's really happening. And we see regularly companies in our portfolio now both acquiring companies acqui-hire-wise and also selling themselves as a team. We had one recently, for instance. So yes, that's happening. More as a strategic move.
Yeah. One area we haven't touched on is regulation. Victor, what do you think we need to see more of or less of on that front in Europe?
I think we need to see less, not more. I think the AI Act, has been revised now, and it's a bit better, but I still think we have a tendency in Europe to gather a bunch of academics who've never been in the private sector, have them write a 150-page report about all the things something could potentially go wrong, give it to the politicians, and then they make rules based off that, right? That's the opposite way they do it in the US, where people invent things, shit happens, people get sued, there's a bunch of lawsuits, and that kind of determines the regulation, right? I'm not saying that necessarily is the right way of doing it either. Maybe we need to find somewhere in the middle that's uniquely European, but we need to move away from this idea that academics can sit in a room and predict what's going to happen in the tech world. Neither founders, scientists, or investors can predict what's going to go on in AI the next 3 months, and academics in Brussels definitely can't. And I think that's very much like, that's a fundamental belief system we have to change. We have to make contact with reality, and we cannot just make ourselves non-competitive because of musings of people that aren't even building this kind of stuff. And I think that's a huge problem we have in Europe. The AI Act is the latest iteration of that, of course, but there are so many other examples, right? I mean, GDPR, for example, there are good ideas, the kernels of it is good, but what has really resulted in, right? We're all just like clicking banners all the time. We're getting the AI models, we're getting them way later than the rest of the world, which makes us even less competitive. And I don't think it really makes a big difference in any consumer's life, despite what the politicians may think. So I'm really hoping to see a reversal on this and a more practical approach. I think we really, really need that.
I think here is something that a lot of founders talk about, like you do, Victor, but also the ecosystem talk about it a lot more. I mean, it's so easy to regulate versus deregulate, and we have to change that balance.
Exactly.
It has to be deregulation, not regulation. And I mean, we have to sort of be much more in the ecosystem outspoken about that.
Yeah.
I think one area which maybe we'll come to capital markets, but what's missing in Europe is later stage funding. I mean, we have a lot of early stage funding, but later stage funding, and particularly public market. I don't know, when you go public with Synthesia, where would you go public? Maybe you think about US?
Never Europe. I don't know where we could list. The London Stock Exchange is a total disaster, right?
Exactly,
That's the most obvious
and
one.
why? And I think that's also fundamental to sort of, over time, build up our own capital markets that is deep enough to cater for most successful companies.
Yeah.
And of course, one thing is that we have so many exchanges and they're never going to merge to one, and we have not same listing requirements in all of them, which is sort of a mess. But we can start from the underlying side, like foster savings in equity. So in Sweden, for instance, 7 out of 10 people save in stock-related stuff. In continental Europe, that's 1 out of 10. And the pension systems in Europe are geared for building themselves on interest, not on equity story. So Europe is not participating in the successes. So I think we really need to sort of enforce and create a savings economy across Europe. And that's something that EU can work on as well.
Exactly.
Like exporting what I think I can brag about the Swedish saving schemes that are tax efficient, etc. We can export that, and we can change the pension system so they can save more equity. And by that, we'll deepen our capital markets and make sure that Synthesia go public in London or Amsterdam or whatever it is.
I could not agree more. I mean, if you look at Denmark, for example, right? We've built a system where the only way for the average person to really make money is by buying and selling houses, right?
Yeah.
Which is the most unproductive for society. That's detrimental to most people, because most people, if you're not on the property ladder, you're never going to be able to buy a house, right? Instead of putting it in equity, where it's actually productive for society, right? In Denmark, I forgot what the number is, right? But it's like some ridiculously low number you can put into your like stock saving account. And there's so many of these like structural things. I think, as you said, so much of the capital in Europe is old money. That's rent seeking. It's not risk capital. So when you have all these exchanges like the LSE, right? There's no liquidity. There's so many of these problems that I think, and a lot of those things I think we can solve with simple incentives.
Exactly. I mean, you can have different opinion about Trump, but now they just implemented the Invest in America Act or something like that, where each newborn gets a savings account and a couple of $1,000, and where companies can tax-free donate to these accounts. So from day one, they start saving for their pension and participate in the capital markets and wealth creation. I think those are the kind of initiatives that we should really, one or two of those to foster the capital market thinking could be revolutionary in Europe.
Absolutely.
What do you think it will take, though? I had a phone call with Saul Klein from Local Globe, the UK big fund, yesterday, and he was saying 80% of later stage funding in the UK is not from UK investors. In the Bay Area, it's 80% is from the US going into later. So it's like complete flip. And he was saying it's so stupid because every time a UK company succeeds, it's a Canadian teacher, a member of the Saudi royal family, someone in Sweden, because the Swedish pension funds do invest, and it's not like the average person in the UK. So like, what do we think it takes? I guess it's a big storytelling exercise to convince the general public in Europe or policymakers in Europe or whoever it is who needs to, I don't know whether it's a push or a pull thing, whether we force, say this is happening in the UK pension funds to invest more into this segment of the economy, or we tell people it's a great idea and it happens. Like, what do you think it takes?
Yeah, I think we do. I think we want to incentivize pension funds to put much more capital into growth stage companies, which I think is good for society, and I think also will be good for them, right? I think the issue is kind of twofold. Today, a lot of growth stage investors in Europe are from private equity, right? Like they're from the finance industry, which is different from the Bay Area, where most people are technologists. And in my own personal experience, and I know a lot of other founders' experience, right, is when you get to like a certain stage, you're basically dealing with like finance people, right? Not that VCs aren't finance people, but you're dealing with people whose understanding of business is very abstract, right? It's like a spreadsheet. If your company makes sense in a spreadsheet, you may be lucky and get an investment. But if it doesn't, then someone from the US will sweep in and say, you know what, I don't think the numbers are perfect, but I think your product could go here in 2 or 3 years, and I think that'll create a really big company, right? And depending on the stage you're at, like that's the kind of mindset you need if you want to make big wins. You can't understand everything through spreadsheets. And I think that's just how it is in Europe, because we have a big finance industry, and most VCs at that stage are from the private equity industry. But of course, that mindset is also enforced by the fact that there isn't as much capital, right? The more capital there is, the more competition there is, the more you also have to take risks, and you feel more daring to take risks. So I think there's like some structural things that we can do better. But I think a lot of it would help if we had more capital inflows into these growth stage funds.
Iwona, is this on EU Inc.'s, I imagine, quite long to-do list?
I mean, I think I look at Ewing as an opportunity for Europe to unlock capital flow across Europe. So I think it's estimated by Deal Room that it would unlock $1 trillion of capital flow across Europe. What it will do, it will build more early stage momentum, more success stories. And as we are seeing more success story, we will have more investors, even old money, probably wanting to get into that space, so invest in risk capital. It's something I've been thinking about also on a personal level. It's like, how do we encourage? Like, I know so many wealthy people, but they tend to invest in the US, etc. So it's a really a pity. But I think if we have more success stories in Europe and we build the right infrastructures, we can really encourage. One of the very good ideas that I read about recently is that, for example, Israel invests in, they encourage investments from wealthy people into higher risk capital, such as venture capital, by giving them incentive that if you don't get a return in 10 years, we will pay you the money back. I think it's a great incentive, and I think we need to build that in Europe to encourage more of the investments. In terms of unifying the single market as well, and potentially having a capital union market in Europe, that would be probably solve a lot of issues. And I think it's, like I said, Ewing, I think it's a foundational first step reform towards potentially doing that, but I might be biased. But, one step at a time. We can't fix it all.
To end on, we've got a few minutes left, to end on, I guess, an optimistic note, one of you just mentioned, I think it was Victor, the importance of people who've run companies before getting into investing as well. And we have seen, I think, just in the past few years, an enormous uptick, haven't we, in founders and operators investing. Sifted, we get, I don't know how many, hundreds of press releases every week. And the list is normally, a few names of funds, and then increasingly 10 names of entrepreneurs who've individually invested. And that was not the case a while back. So I feel like this cycle of giving back, one generation investing in the next. Companies are proud, aren't they, when they have a mafia of companies that have spilled out for them. I guess you saw this at Entrepreneur First, Kitty, didn't you? But it feels like the cogs are starting to whir in that sense.
Actually, well, with Project Europe, we've been, super fortunate to have 200 of Europe's best founders backing us from the outset. And so it means that instantly all the teams we back have the 200 best founders in Europe on their cap table. And also by having them as investors, we almost synthesize the alumni network, because it takes a long time, obviously, for a program like YC, Entrepreneur First, etc., to build that alumni network of people who can come in, advise, support, provide network to, and encourage, who've kind of broken the ice ahead of these founders. And the thing that's phenomenal for us and for our founders is to have people like Victor, who, sitting among many other founders like him, with all his contacts, all his knowledge, they're able to answer the questions these founders have, and it really, really, really accelerates the process. Capital does so much, but actually access to people, knowledge, pathways through things makes a far bigger difference in many ways.
Amazing. We are just about out of time, so thank you so much to my panel, and thank you to everyone listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.